which these young people are all about, you need to keep nuclear in the mix, at least in the short term, because these plants are not being replaced necessarily by zero-carbon alternatives.
Right. There are other nuclear proponents, Bill Gates among them, who was in D.C. recently lobbying for billions of dollars to be spent on a new generation of these nuclear plants. What happened with that effort?
It's not easy. The average age of a nuclear plant is 39 years right now in the United States. The technology has kind of been frozen in time. Bill Gates is investing in a technology called TerraPower, which is sodium-cooled, not water-cooled. It has some inherent safety capabilities. The company wanted to build its first plant in China, but at the first of the year, with the trade war that the Trump administration engaged in with that country, those plans were scuttled. There's one other company, NuScale, that is building these small modular water-cooled reactors, and there's a plant that is in stages of being permitted, which will be built in Idaho. That has some inherent safety features as well. A lot of people would tell you that there is a whole new generation of nuclear out there that has many more safety features in it than the current fleet, and it's time now to put some investment in those.
All right, Miles O'Brien, our science correspondent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. So, interestingly enough, Pennsylvania has been, like as we were talking about, like the 3 Mile Island incident has been at the center of a lot of the energy policy debate. Actually, some of you may know, when oil started in the 19th century, it was in Titusville, in western Pennsylvania. So the first oil exploration happened over here. Rockefeller developed all of these things. For a very long time, actually, with the oil industry, they didn't know what to do with the oil, right? Like they knew they had a lot of energy. But now, like actually, they mentioned something about shale gas. The shale gas revolution went ahead in Pennsylvania, right? So, like, you know, this Texas, of course, it has been very big. But in this area, which is very close to a lot of demand centers, is where we have seen a lot of growth of natural gas during the last decade. Actually, I did my graduate studies in upstate New York. When you compare New York State versus Pennsylvania, it's a natural experiment that is quite fascinating because New York State declared a moratorium. They said, we're not going to be developing shale gas resources, whereas Pennsylvania went full steam ahead. So you have two states with very similar characteristics in terms of the climate. I mean, New York is, of course, a little bit colder. But over here, we have done a lot of shale gas development. So here is a little bit of the projections and composition of what they were talking about. So as you can see, we still rely, like actually let me point out over here. So we have nuclear at this point, what he was talking about, right, around 19%. We have renewable energy that is around the same. Natural gas is still a significant amount of what we use. And this is full energy, right? So like, you know, like for example, many of us are driving cars that are internal combustion engines. Internal combustion engines still requires oil, right? So generally, in that sense, like there's some transition towards electric cars, but that's actually what is shown over here. So like this is actually perhaps something that the Energy Information Administration, which is the statistical agency for the US, does. That is create something that they call the annual energy outlook. And in that annual energy outlook, they say, okay, this is where we are now. This is where we expect to be in the next 10 to 30 years. So they go up to 2050. So as you can see, electric power is growing, but it's growing at a relatively modest pace. Transportation is relatively flat. Industrial is expected to continue growing, right? So in those kind of cases, in the case of electricity, decarbonizing is relatively easy, but in other sectors, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. In terms of the emissions, most of the emissions are coming from petroleum, right? Like, and it's not only because of transportation, it's also for industrial processes. Natural gas creates a lot of emissions, and natural gas is used mostly in electricity, but also in industrial processes. And coal is on the decline for many factors. Actually, like during the last years, and now with the crisis in Europe, coal has seen a little bit of a spike because Russia is not providing, like they have like some issues with Nord Stream. And as you can see, like, you know, like these are the billion metric tons of the emissions that we're going to be having from each one of the different sectors. You can see that electric power is the one that is declining the fastest. It's the one that we think, and it's a number of combination of things, right? So like in electric power, most of the policies are going to be made by what we call system operators, so they're relatively easy to implement. On transportation, on the other hand, is our decisions, the ones that are going to be driving a lot of that change, right? So like, it's going to be driven by personal choices and maybe some kind of like policy nudges, right? Like maybe many of you have heard that the Inflation Reduction Act has some credits.
Right.
So you have $3,750 for battery, according to the country of origin, and another $3,750. So you can actually deduct it in order to start encouraging people to get more electric cars. Now, linking a little bit to what Father Barry was talking about, so I found two passages, and this is a suggestion from Anne, so thank you very much, Anne, for that. It's this is from Psalm 24:1-2 that says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." Right. So that's telling you something about our stewardship. And we know that the whole creation has been growing as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves grown eagerly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Okay, so like generally, like we need to take care for the environment, and this is part of like what we came here to do, right? Like to make sure that, and it's not only a human thing, right? Like it's also like the degradation of the species that are gonna be living. I think that sometimes a lot of the debate is framed in terms of like what are the human impacts, which are of course very important, but there's also like the loss of biodiversity and things like that are gonna be affecting us. Now, I'm an economist, so like, I know that that's a little bit of a dirty word sometimes, but like, like, I care about price signals. And these are the prices that we see in Pennsylvania. I think that like, at the end, even though the price of electricity is not very salient, we just pay our bill once a month, and that's when we think about the electricity. And probably for many of us, we don't care too much about what the price of electricity is. There are communities in which actually they're going to be suffering energy insecurity, and this is going to be a concern. So price in Pennsylvania is not particularly high. In New York, New England territory is much higher. So here the darker shades of blue are corresponding to states where it's more expensive. California is relatively expensive. The central part, like Wisconsin, Iowa, all of those areas are relatively similar. Pennsylvania is relatively cheap, right? So we're paying around 11 cents per kilowatt hour. Which is much cheaper than, for example, in New York. Now, we as humans, we're sinusoidal, right? So we go to sleep, we don't have too much activity during the middle of the night, and then we ramp up our activity in 8 a.m. when we go for our coffee, we start working, and because of that, our patterns of electricity are exactly like following our daily activity, right? So we go up, and then we go down, and we go up, and we go down. So it's a sinusoid, kind of like curve. One thing that these are different reference cases that the Energy Information Administration is doing, in which you can see initially this yellow part is corresponding to solar energy. We don't see a big penetration of that one, so like by 2050 we expect to see way more. We still see, so actually you're going to be, this blue part is corresponding to natural gas. Natural gas is still expected to be part of the generation mix. So I'm originally from Colombia. In Colombia, the reliability of electric power is much lower, right? So there's areas in which actually they are used not to have electricity. But over here, like we are, we turn off the switch and we expect to have electricity. So either one of two things can happen. Is we get more used to blackouts or like to start having more like kind of intermittency in terms of the service, or we're gonna have to start changing our habits, right? So like this is another one that is in the case in which the renewables become very cheap, which is something that has happened in the last decade. So I finished my PhD in 2012. Back then, everything that was talked about in terms of renewable was wind power. Now, solar power is incredibly cheap because it has come, the cost of solar power has come down precipitously. So if that is possible, we can see even more penetration of the solar. And here, this black part is going to be corresponding to battery storage, something that the previous piece was talking about. That is, imagine that we actually come up with good batteries that are going to be responsibly sourced. That is possible. That is going to be increasing the penetration and accommodating all of that intermittency variability that we have from renewables. Now, I want to dispel a couple of things that is not possible. This is actually from California. So in California, they've been growing their GDP and their population has been growing. But their emissions have been going down. their emissions per capita have been going down, and the emissions per unit of GDP have been going down. So it is not true that in order to decarbonize, you need to sacrifice growth, right? Like you need to start taking some trade-offs. Like I'm an economist again, so you're gonna have. I don't wanna paint a rosy picture that everything is gonna be rainbows and unicorns and everything is gonna be possible. We need to start taking very concerted action, right? But it's possible to continue growing and start reducing our emissions. If we design many things. Now, Pennsylvania, we're relatively conservative, right? We're not a state that is leading the way in terms of ambitions. One thing that you see is that in terms of the reduction that we have seen from between 2005 and 2017, we're only 19. The shale industry is very important over here still. There's still some coal communities, and the transition for those communities is a matter that is not going to be very easily resolved, right? We need to see what is the good set of, for example, new livelihoods that we can provide to these people, and the kind of transfer that we can provide in order to make sure that there are not going to be too many inequities in that kind of transition. Now, in the US, as a foreigner, I became a national citizen a couple of years ago here, but I feel that here is a fascinating thing because I come from a place where everything is very centralized, and over here is completely the opposite, right? So every state is on their own. You have even different driver licenses for every state, which I find funny. So it's in that sense, it's like you cross the state and you have a completely different regulation. With policies, exactly the same things. So every state can determine whatever amount of renewables they want to do. Now, this is an electoral year, so probably every time that you contact your representatives, think about that, right? So they're gonna be doing whatever people contacting them is gonna be pushing for. Pennsylvania, it's relatively small, so in that sense, we want to be 18% renewable by 2021. Every state can put the target, and this target doesn't have teeth. So in the sense that it's kind of like a voluntary commitment. If I don't know of any state that hasn't complied with it, because usually it's the same thing that happens with climate change, which I understand you were talking about last week. When the countries do the nationally determined contributions, they tend to be very conservative. So it's almost sure that they're going to be achieving them. But that is actually what we call the Renewable Portfolio Standards. That's what the RPS stands for. Many states are way more ambitious, right? So Hawaii wants to do 100% by 2045, right? Of course, there's heterogeneity. There's very intrinsic differences that actually are going to be driving that possibility. Now, one thing that I also want to dispel is the myth that our actions cannot make changes. And I think that this is probably more important in times of crisis. So California recently had a close to blackout. So it was a very close call. This was during the early September, so this was on September 6th. And they were ready to actually go into rolling blackouts for certain communities. Now, just before we were talking about the Texas case, when you do blackouts, it's a difficult process in many cases because first, restoring the power back is not very straightforward. You're going to have to start bringing all of this into synchronicity. I don't want to get too technical, but that basically the way that you can think about supply and demand is that we match it 60 times per second. That's what we call 60 hertz, right? So and basically it's because it's spinning machines, right? So you have a generator that is producing all of this power. But once you have a blackout, bringing all of these machines into synchronicity again, it's a long process. So even in the case of Texas, they were saying that if they had gone into blackout, it would have taken around 3 weeks in order to start bringing the power back, because you have to start cranking up things slowly. In California, what they did is something very simple. So that is the governor sent, with the authority of the governor, they sent, I don't think that the governor is sending anybody anything directly, but with the authority of the governor, they sent an appeal for people to start reducing their consumption. And reducing their consumption sometimes, this was during a heat wave, it's just a matter of adjust your thermostat and make sure that instead of being at 78, you put it at 75. Couple of degrees, which in your case, the other way around. If you're at 78, you're actually putting 81 or something like that, right? So that you're going to be a little bit hotter. And in the winter, same thing, right? You maybe want to start reducing the temperature a little bit from whatever your comfort is. Those couple of degrees can make a huge difference because this is an emergency. I'm not saying that we need to do it all the time. If we do it all the time, amazing. But if it's during an emergency, that can make a big difference. And I don't know if this is too frivolous of a comparison, but it's the same thing that when you have a patient that is going into some kind of an arrest, at that moment, having that punch of adrenaline can make a big difference, right? Like now, you don't need adrenaline all the time, but you need it in those moments. So for us to be more aware of what is happening at any point, and like also for the government to start contacting us more frequently, can make a big difference. So bottom line is, by our daily behaviors, we can start providing support to the network and provide support to all of this. I'm going to be talking mostly about electricity, but in general about the transition to renewables. Now, this is actually one of the pictures that I took about a wind farm. So as you saw, in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of potential, but we haven't developed it because we have a number of other resources in which they're not still fully depreciated. But there's still plenty of possibilities of having wind farms. Now, there's one question that always comes at the forefront of whenever you invest. And I love this picture because you can see that this is from the Netherlands. Initially, they invested in these early generation wind farms. And now they're like the new ones are dwarfing the older ones, right? So in that sense, you're going to be living with many generations of different technologies. And that is natural. It's the same thing that like when we decide to move to an electric car, a lot of people tend to wait because something better and newer. It's the same thing that when you're buying a laptop. I want to wait for the next year because it's going to be way more powerful or even a phone, right? Like, it's going to be having way more features. In reality, you can have all of those overlapping technologies and they can really help to contribute to decarbonize. Now, Pennsylvania is here in the center of the pack. We have 18% of electricity sold by 2021, and we already passed that target. We should contact our elected representatives in order to make them push for more ambitious targets. We have very low penetration of solar, 0.5%. And in 2021, renewable energy for Pennsylvania, net electricity generation. So we have ways to go, right? And we can do it, but still, there's a lot of generation from the shale gas mostly sector. This is the total combination, so that you can see like natural gas is the largest one. Coal is still making a large percentage of what we do. Nuclear is still significant, and the generic hydro and variable renewable energy sources is much smaller. Now, when we compare to other areas, the Northeast is generally a laggard. So the way that you can think about that graph is whenever it's the red line, is that like your amount of renewables is much higher than whenever it's the, or like your targets are going to be below. They're going to be the targets, and this is actually the actual. So the actual is much higher than the targets that they have. So for us, they're much lower, right? So like we still have ways in which actually we can improve. Now, what can we do locally, right? Which is basically what I think many of us are always wondering. Basic things, right? You can start insulating your house. You can use less electricity. So like something very simple, like changing your light bulbs, can make a big difference. Yes.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
So the Midwest is crushing it.
Yes.
How?
Because, well, I would say that it's natural endowments. When you think there's a lot of hurricanes in the center of the country, they have a lot of wind in that area. So, like in that sense, if you're going to be talking about Iowa, Kansas, Texas, all of them, they have so much wind potential that they can produce over there. And for them, it's very economical. So it's very, very cheap for them. So our wind resource is much lower quality. So in this case, it's kind of like that comparison of like competitive advantage. So they have an absolute advantage in producing versus us. For us, we have a much lower wind resource available.
Our wind quality is less than the Midwest.
Yeah.
Did I just hear you say wind quality?
Right.
Yeah, wind quality is kind of like a weird term, but the way that we think about it. Yeah,
because holy cow, why don't we just plant more windmills?
That's a super good question. And in terms of the policy, it's been a difficult thing. So like what happens is that think of like the way, even when we were creating the electricity system back in the 19th century, the way that Nikola Tesla was thinking that we were going to be producing electricity was, we have Niagara Falls, we can produce a lot of electricity over there, and then we can transmit it to the big demand center that was New York City, right? So like that was actually when the AC system was implemented. In the case of wind, we could do something similar. Put most of the wind farms in the center of the country and then start exporting towards the other parts. In reality, and some of you may be familiar, what happens is that the electricity network in the US, it's actually 3 networks. Texas is a separate network, so actually if they wanted
Yeah,
to...
but we don't care about Texas.
that may be true, but so in that sense, Texas is apart, right? The Eastern Interconnect and the Western Interconnect are the same machine, so all of us are synchronized at 60 hertz. So we can actually start exporting some of that. Usually the main concerns that happen is that the people, the local producers, they feel that you're exporting cheap power that should be used locally. So putting those transmission lines into place is a very difficult process. So generally the Department of Energy has been trying to facilitate all of this interconnection process and saying, hey, we should start creating more interconnections, particularly to where the demand centers are. But it's still very difficult, in terms of permitting those transmission lines. It's very tough.
So we have 3, am I saying this correct, grid systems?
Yes.
Texas, East and West?
Yes.
Each state controls its state?
No, I don't have a graph over here.
So who's in charge of East, who's in charge of West?
It's a big mess. So it's everything in the US. So what happens is that you have the same network, so all of them need to be synchronized. Administratively speaking, we divided them into something that we call independent system operators. So for example, here we are in Pennsylvania, we are under something that is called PJM. Originally it was Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. Now it's 13 states plus the District of Columbia. And you can think that this is kind of like a control tower that says, because we're in a deregulated market, like everybody participating in the electricity system participates, offers whatever they want to do, and then they clear the market. It's an option, right? Now, what they do is administratively. Physics is still, for example, if there's a disturbance down in Florida, Florida doesn't have a market. Florida is centrally managed, right? So they have over there FPL, which is Florida Power and Light. And they own the company, like NextEra is one of the big generators. They own everything and they tell each one of them what they have to do. So these system operators, they need to coordinate with each other, right? And this coordination is mostly through the legal, they say, okay, we're going to be having this exchange at hour 10, at hour 11, and so on. Does that answer your question?
But wouldn't this be a perfect example of why a federal government is created? To benefit the whole.
Yeah, I won't enter too much into the politics. I don't know that the government could do anything to force the states. So the states agree to be in these kind of systems. And for example, the federal government can create incentives for each one of the markets in order to use more electricity. I don't think that the federal government believes FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They believe in subsidiarity, so they don't think that they should be operating the network. They feel that, generally speaking, and this is maybe a legacy of the way that this grew. Initially, before we had all of these large interconnected systems, the way that the electricity system grew was by small microgrids, right? So you have a local microgrid, like here in Pennsylvania, and then they started talking to the people in New Jersey, and then they started talking to the people in Maryland. So PJM was started in 1920. So they try to respect those historical things.
So, Texas, I think, is just such a perfect case study because it is independent. It is very political. They provide quote unquote cheap energy until, of course, we had that winter when they couldn't provide the energy. Only El Paso is in the Western grid,
it's in the Western grid,
which did not suffer any consequences of the horrible winter. And it's a huge political bomb in Texas when people have a little memory about whether or not we should be part of a larger network or private. But when energy is cheap, then we can run on that and keep ourselves in power. And then wind, of course, is taking over oil in Texas.
It's plentiful over there. So, actually, Texas right now has way more wind than California, which is the state that everybody thinks is the most progressive one. So, yeah, that's absolutely right. I want to point something on that. So like, generally, the people in the Eastern Interconnect, and particularly in El Paso, they are paying around 2 cents extra per kilowatt hour, which you can think that is an insurance against those kind of extra events. 2 cents is not too much, right? Like so, just to give you an idea. So like that, what that would mean is like in terms of your electricity bill, at the end you may end up paying like around like maybe $2 extra, maybe $1.70 additional, in order to have more reliable power. Right? But like, I think in certain cases we push for a lot of competition. So it's sometimes satisfying to just know I pay the cheapest power, and like some people go after that, right? So well, like going back to some of the actions, like we can start selecting different appliances. And talking about the role of federal government, the government does actually a number of programs in order to incentivize us to, for example, buy more energy efficient refrigerators and like get like more efficient heat pumps and air conditioners and things like that. Transportation is a huge component of whatever we do. So like in that sense. If we drive a lot, we have a big carbon footprint. And by reducing our driving behavior, or carpooling or things like that, that can make a big difference. And what I mentioned before, turn down the water heater, use less water and shower, reduce, reuse, recycle, and plant a tree. So things that probably you have heard, they do have a huge impact. So actually, this, I wanted to give you some resources. Of course, this links and the presentation is going to be available for everybody. So this is just drilling into the local level. The Environmental Protection Agency provides a calculator that tells you what is your current carbon footprint. And it has a number of features that allow you to start seeing how to modify it. So I'm going to go through the presentation and then we'll go to the carbon footprint for those of you that are interested. Now, for the church, there's a couple of things that we can do also as a community. So Anne found this one that is about the Faith Common Good. There is a certification that actually allows to see, it's kind of like a way of encouraging people to actually enter into more greener behaviors from the church point of view, right? So we can consider some of that. 360carbon.org, one of the things that they do, and this is, I know that this is a controversial topic, but you probably have heard about cap and trade, emissions trading. One thing that you can always do is I try to offset the emissions that I have by, for example, passing some, I live in Colombia, we have a lot of deforestation in the Amazons. If you pass some of the resources here in order to stop deforestation in the Amazons, it's a much cheaper, it's a much more cost-effective manner of reducing emissions, because at the end, carbon is global, it's the ultimate public good. So it doesn't matter if the carbon gets emitted here or if the carbon gets emitted in down because of some trees being cut. So there's a number of organizations what they try to do is start looking for places where it's cheaper to start mitigating carbon, for example, carbon emissions. Okay, so that is a possibility. Now I know that there's all sorts of moral issues sometimes associated to them, because in certain cases it might be that some of these communities, they want to raise standards of living or things like that. That's a whole other discussion. So probably there's people way better qualified than me to talk about some of those moral implications. But all I'm saying is that sometimes it's cheaper to do it somewhere else. Okay? And then the Anglican Church in England has an effort to move all of their churches to be carbon free. So actually, let me just give you a brief look. So this is the footprint calculator at the EPA. Screen. And you can start with the home energy. I fill it up. Actually, I'll show you when I did it for myself. So I live on my own and I have a small apartment, so I don't use a lot of electricity. But basically, there's going to be three main parts that we're going to be considering: the home energy, the transportation, and the waste. And you just have to start feeling whatever is, for example, how much are you paying in your natural gas to UGI? How much do you pay to PPL or to MERET for your electricity, fuel oil, and propane? And also, if, for example, you decided to increase the temperature or during the summer, or decrease the temperature during the winter, how much would that save, right? In terms of the heating and cooling. So that would allow you to look for specific actions in which you can start reducing how much energy you're putting out. Now, in terms of the Church of England, they have a very manual one, so actually we can fill it up. So you can just say in electricity, and they have like all of the factors, and then you can start adding to find what is your total emissions, right? Like, and once you know, like I know that there's the old adage that what gets measured gets managed, but at least you need to start for understanding what is the baseline of your current consumption. This is the collaborative carbon, which is talking about, like for example, doing all of this basically offsetting with like buying, for example, from a project somewhere else and doing some like in that sense, try like to offset the total amount of emissions that your organization is doing. And this is the one that Anne had, that is about the Green Sacred Spaces certification, right? So that this is a way in which actually we can consider taking some of these actions at the church level. Okay? So like I'll just walk you very quickly through my carbon footprint. This is the first one in which I feel for the home energy. So like generally, as I said, I live in an apartment, so I don't use a lot of energy. And it tells you, like for example, the number of gallons of gas, the number of trees, or the amount of recycling that like your actions are going to be taking, like the impact of your actions in terms of like whatever you're going to be doing. Okay? And as I said, I know that it's sometimes we as humans have a problem with aggregation. So we think that like whatever we do is not enough. But believe me, like, you start aggregating the behavior of hundreds of households, that starts adding up. Right? Sometimes it's almost an exponential behavior. And we saw it, like, I think that like even with the COVID crisis, we don't understand very well exponential behavior. We just think, oh, like, what I do is going to be very small, but it can have huge effects. So, for example, if 100 of your friends took this action over 5 years, you would avoid 2 million tons of emissions. That is quite significant. Okay? And like this would be equivalent to burning 106,000 gallons of gasoline. Right? So that like really, just by aggregation, 100 people is not that much. I mean, I don't know that I have 100 friends, but I probably have 100 people that I know in my network. Right? So that, in that sense, it's something that we can do. Well, this is for people that want to pick into my energy use. Now I'm going to go into the final part of this talk that is about a project that I'm working on right now. Generally speaking, states are trying to implement a number of measures in order to improve, like for example, what is our carbon emissions, what is the total consumption of electricity and fuel and things like that that we're having as individual consumers. One thing that happens is that, and I include, this is my electricity bills from when I was living in Easton. One thing that you notice, of course, I don't expect anybody to know their electricity bill. I know it pretty well because it's occupational hazard. But as you can see, like there's a huge increase in my amount of energy that I was using. I was living in a relatively inefficient house, and I am a renter. Generally speaking, that's exactly the problem that we have. In economics, the fancy name is the principal agent problem. A lot of the people that are on the lower income distribution, and I'm not part of that lower income distribution, I'm a renter by choice, but a lot of people actually are renters because that's the only thing that they can do. What happens is that if you have a program that is actually for like providing incentives to improve your AC or your refrigerator, and you're a renter, you probably are not going to be taking them, right? Because like at the end, the benefits are going to be accruing to your landlords, right? So that, in that sense, I'm not going to be doing those kind of actions. Now, from the state point of view, or from the government point of view, the way that they subsidize all of these projects is by doing, over here you can see that there's, well, I don't know if you can read it, but here there's something that says customer charge, distribution improvement charge, solar requirement charge. So there's a number of fixed costs that are assessed to everybody, all of us. As long as we're paying electricity, everybody's paying those fixed costs. Now, who's getting the benefits of those kind of like programs? Mostly the people that are going to be buying electric cars, getting cheaper refrigerators and so on, right? Because like they are the ones that are going to be taking these actions. So you can think that this is actually a cross subsidy from lower income people to higher income people, because everybody pays the same electricity, right? So like, and everybody's going to be subject to the same charges. Now, in the case of Pennsylvania, we have something that it's a market for the retail level. So actually we can choose who our provider is, both for electricity and for gas. I believe, and this is actually what I want to establish in the next years, is like, I've seen a lot, how many of you who go to Walmart? Not many people.
Walmart.
Not many people go to Walmart. I go to Walmart every now and then. And in Walmart I see a lot of people that actually are giving big promotions in order for people to switch. I don't know that is predatory, but I believe that sometimes what happens is that there's a lot of teaser rates in which lower income households are being asked, hey, I'll give you a 55 inches screen TV if you switch to this other provider. They seem to have a lower teaser rate, and then the rates go up. And these people end up being stuck with higher electricity bills in the long run, right? And it's something similar. So I guess that many of you lived through the 2008 financial crisis. Many people were also getting into a lot of these kind of teaser mortgage rates, in which at the very beginning you have a super low interest rate, and then after 5 years, is what they have a balloon payment, so it just goes up. I think in electricity something similar is happening. So I'm trying to see whether there's some predatory behavior happening in this. And as I said, every time that I go to Walmart, you do it as an exploration. Check, and you see that there's a lot of people that are trying to push these new projects. And I think that what they're targeting is low information households, right? People that actually they see this seems to be a great deal. Sign me up. So this is actually the Better Business Bureau warns of potential scams. Actually, when I was living in Easton, now I live in an apartment, so actually people cannot go to my door. But before, actually, people could directly knock on my door. And I had, just before moving in July, and I'm not exaggerating, 3 people knocking on my door asking me, hey, can we see your electricity rate? So they're getting into very aggressive advertising and marketing of your rates. And a lot of people may sign up, right? So in that sense, there may be, first of all, what I want to understand is what is the take-up of these kind of offers among low-income households? I want to understand also among high-income households, because everybody, I don't think that everybody's going to be high information household. So they may not understand completely the consequences of whatever they're signing up. And who doesn't want a 55 inch, while 65 is now the new for 75 inches TV, right? It's a very enticing thing. So some people may sign up for that. But I think that is going to be creating even further issues in which people are going to be paying more and more in electricity. So for that, we are designing a survey, and what we want to do, actually, this is in conjunction with some colleagues in Ohio, that we're going to be trying to see among, we want to focus on this area, Easton Bethlehem, the PPL service area, and understanding how people are actually switching to new consumers and to new providers. And the main question is how pervasive is going to be this behavior, and how regressive can it be, right? And can we quantify what is the size of that subsidy that low-income households are passing to high-income households? Now, in terms of asymmetric information, this is one of the other things. So this is actually a screenshot of my phone. As I mentioned, when you were asking about how does it work. So PJM is the system operator in our area, kind of like the control tower. You can sign up for that, and you can see when prices are high. So just to give you something, I don't know if you're going to remember many things from this presentation, but if you remember something typical, price of electricity at the wholesale level is around $70 per megawatt hour. That is a regular price, right? And at the retail level, you can think that is around 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you transform 15 cents from kilowatt hours to megawatt hours, that's $150 per megawatt hours, right? So that's what I say, 70 cents at the wholesale level. At the retail level, there's all of these costs that I was talking about, right? The solar distribution charge and things like that. So a price at the wholesale level of 70 is reasonable. It could be cheaper. I would say that that's still normal. Whenever the prices shoot up to $1,000, that's when the system is in emergency, right? So if you receive that kind of alert, of course, this is for different areas. So for example, here's PPL. PPL was a 961 as opposed to 100. At the wholesale level, it should be around 760. So significantly higher. That means start using less at that point, right? In those cases, it can make a big difference. I'll be happy to take any questions. And thank you to Father Berry. I also received input from Marianne, which we could enjoy, and to Ant for the feedback. So I would love to discuss any other things or comments that you may have. Father Berry.
The war between Russia and Ukraine and the coming crisis in Europe, what's the long? I mean, this is an easy question, right? What's going to be the consequence for power globally, let alone for the United States? I mean, I have great fear that we're just not going to recover from the winter.
Yeah. Well, like my crystal ball is quite cloudy, so it's
Uh-huh. What do you see though in the midst of the cloud?
But I do think that there's two things that I think are gonna be happening. First of all, I think that there's gonna be a rebound of use of coal in many places, right? So and this was where I wanted to start with nuclear. I understand that the people have a fear towards nuclear, but like after Fukushima, the German government took a very hard stance on nuclear power, and because of that, they're very reliant. That's what they created two pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and that was part of like the bargaining that Angela Merkel did when she was chancellor. Now, because of that, they said natural gas is clearly cleaner than coal. Right, so like that was a good thing to do at that point. And same thing happened here in the U.S. Right, so we used to be reliant on coal, and during the last 15 years, there's been this shale gas revolution, and we have shifted. Now, because they have no nuclear power, and now they're curtailing in natural gas, it's very likely that the emissions of coal are going to be going up. Now, I feel that this is probably going to be a blip. I want to be an optimist, right? So, I think that like this is going to be a harsh winter, right? There was this show, Game of Thrones, like winter is coming.
Right.
But recently I was listening to something in the Financial Times. So in Italy, north of Italy has a harsh winter, even though they don't have very bad winters. Now they have like a little bit of warm weather in October, which is relatively unusual. And because of that, people are not worried too much about this is kind of like a short-term blip. But they think that actually, in general, the forecast for the winter are not going to be as bad as they expected. So what they were showing is like the traders in Milan were putting the gas at around like 1.5 lower than it usually is. So it might be that it's not as bad as we expected. Everybody had like very low expectations, and I don't know, like this is probably a way of like how do you manage your life. Maybe having bad expectations is good for you, because then it's like whenever things realize, it's gonna be a little bit better. I do think that this is gonna be pushing a lot of the European countries to start doing more, start for example considering nuclear again, and maybe try to diversify. The main thing is these are like oil tankers, pardon the analogy, but moving a country, the portfolio of generation technology takes a long time. So Germany has invested during the last 20 years a lot in wind and a lot in solar. Mm-hmm. They still rely on natural gas, but it is possible that now they're going to be having more cooperation with France that has a lot of nuclear. Okay, so I do think that now this is the optimist in me talking. As anybody, and I don't want to get too political over here, but I think that when President Biden was elected, he came with all of this agenda about decarbonizing the system. And we have seen that actually when the price of gasoline goes up, he has to go talk to the Saudis because people go crazy, right? Nobody wants to pay $5 a gallon. And I am the kind of people that is able to afford that kind of price of gasoline, but I understand that the price of gasoline is very regressive. Right. So sometimes what I feel is that this is a hard policy. I think that the prices of electricity should go up, and you collect more money, and the government should redistribute that money to the low-income households, right? So so in that sense, you have the signal of energy being used in a proper manner. You are not going to be paying low electricity bills or low gasoline bills anymore. But then, you have to trust the government that there's going to be this kind of redistribution happening, and then you pass it to the other people. But if we keep putting gasoline cheap and electricity cheap, people are going to be driving more, and people are going to be using electricity in a less careful. So we need better pricing. That's the bottom line. So I think that we shouldn't continue subsidizing a lot of these things. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, but it's an ongoing conversation. Yep, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I was looking at Pennsylvania, the relatively high use of gas. Mm-hmm. Gas, of course, is not renewable.
Yes.
It's also more poisonous to the atmosphere than most of the other alternatives. Mm-hmm. So what's the future for gas?
Well, like I think I'll answer with what the Energy Information Administration thinks. Natural gas is not going to be going anytime soon. I think that like as you saw, the projections is going to be coming down in terms of the total amount of gas. But it's still, this is for a typical day. I don't know if I was completely clear, but like these are the 24 hours of the day. We're still going to be needing natural gas all throughout the day. Whether we're in the reference case, which is the most likely one in 2050, or whether we're in the low renewables case, then natural gas gets a squeeze. But I think that in this situation, and I know that this is a little bit of hand waving for the answer, natural gas produces emissions. There's nothing around that. So we have to come up with a new technology that is going to be able to capture and sequester some of those emissions. Because the advantage that these kind of technologies have is that you can control them, right? So that, like you heard in the PBS piece that they say, well, what if the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, which is always a problem. You either need storage or you need some technology that you can open the spigots and start producing more or close it, right? And with nuclear it's also possible, but nuclear, I think that like the main issue is public perception. So I feel that it's probably going to be easier to come up with carbon sequestration solutions that actually to like create some kind of like natural gas or like a nuclear new coalition that is going to be producing a lot of it. Does that answer your question?
I've already asked a question, and well, looks like I'm going to ask another. So there are three sources of energy that you haven't touched on, two of which are technologically doable. So one is geothermal. The gold mines in South Africa don't go any more deeper because it's just plain too hot. So about 6 miles down is, I don't know, an abundant source of calories. But we're not even talking about geothermal utilization, extraction, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Plasma fusion energy, which is not clean, there will be radioactive byproducts, but the efficiency is tremendous. And something that Nikola Tesla wanted to have happen was airwave distribution of energy, and instead of, so one idea is to put a lot of, say, solar panels up in space and then microwave it down and burn Texas. I think that's the goal.
Those lasers.
That may be, yeah. So I think
so the technology is there for geothermal. The technology is maturing for fusion. I guess we have the technology, well, maybe not the capacity to light up the whole world with satellite collection of solar energy and then redistribution back down to Earth. I don't know if that's scalable or not. But
yeah.
Why aren't we engaged in geothermal energy?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you the short-term economics answer and like the policy question. So let's talk about geothermal. So geothermal, as you say, in certain countries is more economically viable than here. So like the main issue is that per megawatt hour of production is still way more expensive than any of the technology that is considering these kind of reference cases. So like I think that like in general, like for example in countries like Iceland, they can run their like 90% of their system is geothermal. Here, geothermal is still quite limiting and it's way more expensive than, for example, a combined cycle natural gas plant. So one thing that you can do, and this is where the role of government can come into play, is that if we consider that we are really going to be subsidizing some of those technologies, then you can reduce. Right now, like producing with natural gas is around $20 per megawatt hour. Producing with geothermal in certain areas could be like around $200. So if the government is willing to subsidize that gap and provide to investors, so in many cases this is like generation to a large extent in the US is not done by the government, it's by by private entities, right? So like probably the only exception is in the Pacific Northwest, where you have Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville Power Authority, which are federal entities. All of the other ones are mostly investor-owned utilities. And for the investor-owned utilities, they're going to be investing in whatever is the cheapest one. So if the government creates a guarantee in which, like a production tax credit or an investment tax credit, which is the way that they have done it with wind and solar, for geothermal, that closes that gap between what is the marginal unit in natural gas, which is coming like around $25 per megawatt hour, and the geothermal one, that would be an option, right? You talk about fusion, like, so in terms of fusion, it's still net negative, right? So that, you know, like you put more energy that you can get out of it. I think that there's a number of projects, and the Department of Energy is investing heavily on that one, but it's still not economic, right? So that, you know, like we're going to be having some issues. And with the microwaves of, like, you know, let's say that you're going to be putting some solar panels in outer space. The main issue that you still have with wireless transmission of power is losses, right? So that, you know, you will need to produce a whole lot more than what we're producing right now because of all of the losses that you're going to be having from the production point till the consumption point. So all of those are areas in which having a government with some kind of like a steady policy for the long term, right? Because, you know, these are projects that are going to be lasting 20 years. So if you have a guarantee for 20 years that I'm going to be like subsidizing, like for example, this specific technology, that could work. But even with wind and solar, like, you know, like you probably have heard, like every time, like the production tax credit and the investment tax credit has been set to sunset a couple of times, and then it gets renewed at the, like, you know, at the very last minute, at the 23rd hour. Government, when it decides not to shut down, they say, oh, we're going to be extending this credit. So we need more consistency in terms of energy policy, right? You know, because these investors, whenever they put a new technology, they're going to be married to that technology for 20 years, right? So that, you know, like they will need some of that. Now, all of this, it's like you point out, I think something very important is that we need technological development in certain areas, because those are going to be the ones that actually are going to be bringing down the cost, right? So that, you know, if we can bring down the cost of geothermal, if we can make fusion economical, that would be fantastic, right? You know, like fusion is really kind of like the holy grail. The old joke with fusion is that it's always 5 years in the future, right? So that, you know, like you never know exactly what is going to be that breakthrough. Right. Now there's many companies that are betting on it, and they're receiving the funding, but it's still almost there, right? Like, you know, like, but not quite. I feel that, like, and to give you like, I'll go back to you, Father, but like, you know, like to give you an analogy, the first project plan from the Department of Energy in order to incentivize shale gas was in 1978. So the Department of Energy didn't exist back then. So that was with the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, PURPA, of 1978. And they did this experiment in which they detonated a nuclear bomb underground in order to try to stimulate the shale gas. And at the end, like, you know, like basically what happened is like it sealed the reservoir and nothing could be extracted. The first time that shale gas became economical was around 2005. So we're talking from 1978 to 2005. 1978, the government was the one that put the funding for that. Around the 1990s, they lost interest. So they said, we're not going to continue funding this. Private investors took in the 1990s and did another 15 years of development. And it finally became economical around 2004, right? So that, you know, like we're talking about like 25 years of continued development till shale gas became economical, right? It might be that like the fusion is going to be something like that, right? You know, like, so like government keeps pushing, and then like some investors are going to be putting on that one. And the moment that it becomes economical, like it creates billionaires like Harold Hamm, like all of these people that like really have ridden on the wave of the shale gas revolution. But it's a process that requires patience and like a steady policy. Father,
I think one of the most frustrating things for me is that we have so many technologies to reduce our need for energy that we just aren't implementing. And so, I mean, I know that we could basically insulate our homes to be almost at zero, but we don't have that political will, or there's too much capital wanting us to use energy, and so that there's this constant underlying battle. I'm going to thank you very much, and people can continue to ask questions, but we're at that hour, and This is available online. I'm pointing to the camera so we can watch again. Alberto, thank you so much.
I love to continue the conversation, but as you see here, and with